It's a good point that President Bush actually did have a plan, the initial energizing role in trying to get the nation to think about this devastating impact of addiction. My primary contact with President Bush, though, a guy who had a special standing with the armed forces, was as a division commander during Desert Storm when President Bush came to see us in the desert, Thanksgiving Day. I love telling the story, thousands of soldiers from the 24th Infantry Division surrounding him. And his first words were that in 1944 on Thanksgiving Day, he was flying a combat mission in ground support of this division fighting in the Philippines. But just a tremendous impact on all of us to recognize that, here he was, a teenage combat pilot flying off a carrier in World War II. And then I saw him again. I was Colin Powell's, when he was chairman of the JCF, sort of liaison officer to the Secretary of State and the President. So I was privileged to accompany President Bush to Moscow and Helsinki. And, frequently he liked having the military around him. So frequently I tell people with, multiple heads of state and senior people, and I was a lowly lieutenant general, I'd be the only uniformed guy in the room. And it was not just that the president wanted somebody to tell the chairman of the JCS what was going on. He liked having us around. We loved him.
General, I was also struck in reading and being reminded of that Persian Gulf victory, how quick and complete it was. He had built an international coalition to support that effort, but then he didn't go further and try at the time for regime change in Iraq. Now, today, there's so much controversy, of course, not only his son's administration, but when we look as it regards the Ukraine and Russia's activity in the U.S. trying to figure out what its appropriate role is on the international sphere. When do we intervene? Look at Syria. How much further do we push? The choice that he made it then that was prudent, and he was mocked for, wasn't he?
Yeah, no question. And, I was the division commander, and we were pretty aggressive. We wanted to get across the Euphrates and start toward Baghdad. But certainly in retrospect, we recognize the wisdom of his decision. You've got to remind yourself the senior leadership during Desert Storm, Bush with his combat service in World War II, intense air combat, Schwarzkopf, our theater commander, badly wounded in Vietnam, combat veteran, and Colin Powell, the chairman of the JCS, wounded in combat, Vietnam veteran. They were cautious about warfare. They were appalled at what could happen. At the end of the war, Bush and General Powell basically called it off, saying, we don't want the American people to think we're piling on. So there was a tremendous sense of respect for life out of these senior leaders, starting with the President of the United States.
I guess interesting debate about that time, General. What was the element? Who was the element saying, we need to sort of take out Saddam for the long term? Was there ever a contingent that argued that in force?
Oh, yeah, no question. And by the way, the Iraqi army had just come apart. It was a 30-day air campaign, 4 days of intense ground combat, but the Iraqis just couldn't deal with us. This is a massive, well-equipped army and air force. But we just shattered them on the first day of the air war, and they never could get off their feet. So it would have been easy from a military perspective to have continued and at least gotten Saddam regime out. But I think the President and General Powell and others, Secretary Baker, were really mature, thoughtful, strategic thinking and didn't want to do it. So I think certainly history proved it was the right call.
I also was reading about the reunification of Germany, and we take that for granted now. Obviously, no one did after World War II, and at the time it was still controversial as to whether that would come together in a peaceful way that didn't once again create, European hegemony. And what was his attitude about it at the time? Why was he so sure it wouldn't be a problem for Germany to reunify?
Well, I think history is going to be really kind to President Bush over the years. He had momentous impact on the world as it was then, and it was uncertain. We look back on these events and say, well, of course that was the right thing to do, but there was still widespread fear among the Europeans, never mind the Russians, about a unified Germany. You know, 1939 to 45, they wrecked the entire European theater. So, but I think Bush, again, his generation, they had devastated Germany and Japan, and they saw it clearly, Marshall and Truman, that you had to put your allies back on their feet. So it was unnatural to have Germany, the most powerful country technologically, civilization in Central Europe, not be united. And Bush was able to convince Gorbachev, principally because of his own integrity and trustworthiness and his sense of respect for the Russian people, that he had to go along with it. So it's a great contribution to American national security and European security.
There's Acosta, of course, Wilbur Ross. A few moments ago saw Vice President Pence. But to your point, General, we've been talking about this earlier this morning. He became president at a time where the country needed a gracious winner, for lack of a better word, and that is the role that he filled.
Yeah, well, you know, I think you can argue we always need a gracious winner. You know, that position, essentially, the President of the United States, the most powerful political leader in the face of the globe. Been that way since 1945 at least, and it will continue to be. But I think, you know, President Bush's life, I'm not sure how good a politician he was. I know as a public servant, though, as a man of integrity, as somebody with a strategic vision, understood that collective action and American values and moral purpose is the way we exercise our leadership. It's not just for the most powerful economy in the face of the earth, which we are, the most powerful military, it's American values. And President Bush's life exemplified American values.
You know, General, I remember when he went skydiving a few years ago, and of course being less familiar with all these stories at the time, it struck me as kind of quirky. Now that I understand his life better, I understand that fits perfectly with the kind of risks he always took and the kind of guy that he was. So where did this image that I know bothered him, that he was the wimp, you know, the famous magazine cover, where did that come from?
It's interesting, isn't it? You know, anybody that survives carrier aviation in World War II, just getting on and off those carriers was an act of personal daring and danger every time you did it, never mind air combat. So, look, from his young life, he was an athlete. He was tremendously personally courageous, not unmindful of danger. You know, you read his personal recollections of World War II, but no, he had been there himself, you know, alone with a crew member in a Navy combat aircraft trying to survive. It's a miracle he did survive. You know, when you think about it, his unit suffered enormous casualties. So he did have personal courage. By the way, that, you know, whole parachuting at age 90 struck me as something, you know, I've got a lot of parachute jumps, and I was scared to death every time I did one, so I was amazed at this man doing it in his older years.